The Clery Act and campus safety and security. What's new? Featuring Anna Archilla, Campus Crime Compliance Supervisor, and Jim Moore, Campus Crime Compliance Senior Advisor.
Hello, and welcome to the 2022 FSA Virtual Conference. This session will cover the Clery Act and campus safety. When we talk about the Clery Act, we start with this disclaimer. Some of the materials we will cover today can be a little disturbing. We encourage our Clery group to engage in self-care, and we encourage you to do the same. So if at any point throughout this presentation you need to get up and step away, please do so. We always want to start by explaining how the Clery Act came to be. The picture of the young lady on your screen is that of Jean Clery. Jean left home in 1986 to attend Lehigh University. In the evening of April 5th, 1986, Jean was involved in a horrific crime. Jean was in her dorm room asleep. A male student came into her room to burglarize it, which then escalated to a sexual assault and culminated with her murder. After Jean's death, her parents worked tirelessly to get Congress to pass the Jean Clery Act. The law was signed in 1990. This is a consumer protection law that aims to provide transparency around campus crime policies and statistics. Institutions must understand what the law entails, where their responsibilities lie, and what they can do to actively foster campus safety. This slide shows you what our students are thinking. Sometimes you'll hear the critics of the Clery Act say that students don't care about this stuff. And as you can see, this is simply not true. A survey that was conducted by the Clery Center and ADT Security found 82% of college students are very concerned about their personal safety as they return to school this fall. 97% of students consider their personal safety as they move about campus. 70% of students have talked to their family about ways to be safe on campus. And what we know is that 74% of most of our students start out trusting their institutions to do a great job of providing for safety on campus.
So the next important topic that we want to cover for you are some strategies for your success in terms of risk mitigation in the area of campus safety. The first one is to remember to involve your senior leadership on campus. This includes the president, the president's cabinet, other senior officials, and board members. It is very important that all of these folks are engaged in the campus safety program. It really does start at the top. We also want to encourage you to take advantage of training and technical assistance opportunities, such as through the FSA conference and other learning opportunities that we have throughout the year and that are offered by other associations. We also encourage you to build out your professional network. It's very important to have folks to lean on who might be having the same issues that you are, and you can work together on collaborative solutions. We also ask you to reach out to the stakeholder community. Obviously, this includes your students and employees, but it also includes public safety officials and municipal officials in the near campus community. We also want you to think of always being prepared for the next big thing. So right now, a lot of you know that the Office for Civil Rights at the U.S. Department of Education is undertaking rulemaking for Title IX of the Civil Rights Amendments. And it is very important that you remain aware of what's happening in that space and that you use your opportunity to make comments about the proposed regulations. The same is true when we make changes to the Clery Act. We use a very open regulatory process, and we encourage you to participate. We also want you to be aware of various pitfalls. One of the main pitfalls that we see in the campus safety area is what we call special rules for special talents. It's very important, whether we're talking about a student or employee discipline, that the rules are the same for everybody, that they are clear and understandable, and that there's somewhere that folks can go to make sure that they understand the rules that apply to their conduct and the conduct of those around them. And then there's just the idea of reinforcing accountability. We want to make sure that we're being responsive to complaints and concerns that are expressed by our students and employees. Many of the most serious enforcement cases that we become part of start as cases where folks simply didn't feel that their concerns were heard or that their reports were acted upon in a way that would advance overall safety. And as part of that, we always want to encourage you to be transparent in your dealings with students, employees, and the campus community. Again, the Clery Act itself started because a family felt as though they didn't have the information they needed to keep their students safe. So let's talk about the Clery Act today. Many years ago, the Clery Act was generally thought of as a crime reporting law. It is much more than that today. It's really about rights that accrue to students and employees and the rights of those people to be informed and to have options to seek justice and other services and protections that might be needed so that they can continue their education or continue their work at a school. So we say that the Clery Act today is about people, not paper. The paper is still important. It's very important that your school has an annual security report, that you have clear policies and procedures, but it's really about making sure that people have what they need to be safe on campus. As we move forward, the Clery Act has increasingly become a law that's about student wellness, not just student safety. And we see that with recent initiatives aimed at preventing hazing or preventing suicide on campus. So we want to think about the wellness of our people. Campus safety, crime prevention, and consumer protection remain job one of the Clery Act. Again, we want to take care of what's most important. We want to make sure that we prevent crime whenever we can, and that we are transparent about what has happened when crimes occur so that people can help provide for their own safety. We want to emphasize problem solving and risk mitigation. In the safety area, we will never be able to produce a completely 100% safe campus, and the law doesn't stand for that proposition. It stands for the notion that we need to do all we can to keep people safe and be honest about the risks that may exist in the community. And then we want to make sure that we are doing everything we can to prepare our people through training and through resources, and by building strong partnerships. We heard a little bit about that before. And then making sure that we have the right kind of training for our public safety staff. This is one that is sometimes missed. Public safety professionals have a very tough job. And we need to make sure that there are programs in place to make sure that they are well and treated with respect on campus. As part of that, we need to make sure that public safety folks have the kind of training that has become more important as concerns about police misconduct have increased. We encourage, although you're not required, to provide implicit bias training to officers. Use of force training to make sure that deadly force or other sorts of force are the last resort. There are times when they have to be used, but we want to make sure that we go through the established use of force matrix. And that is all part of encouraging an atmosphere of de-escalation. So let's talk about what's actually required under the Clery Act today. The first thing is that schools are required to compile and disclose accurate and complete crime statistics. That is one of the original requirements of the Clery Act. It is as important today as it has ever been. And then you have to produce and distribute an annual security report. This is a report that includes all of your crime statistics and all of your required policy statements. It has to have a front cover, back cover, all the required information in between. And we need to make sure that we are getting it to our people in a timely manner. In fact, that report has to go out every year by October 1st, unless the department extends the deadline such as it did during the pandemic. Now, we also have to submit our crime statistics to the department through an annual data collection and survey. This is a very important step, and some schools, unfortunately, think that's where the responsibility starts and stops. We have to do both: the annual security report, which goes directly to our students and employees, and then we have to take the crime data from that report and submit it to the department. Schools are required to issue timely warnings and emergency notifications. We'll hear a bit more about that later. Those are two kinds of crime alerts. And then we have to maintain a daily crime log. And the daily crime log is what it sounds like. It is a record that is available to the public that provides additional information about crimes and other incidents that have occurred in the last 60-day time period. Schools have to maintain evacuation and response procedures. This has become increasingly important for some of the reasons that we'll talk about in a few minutes. And for schools that have campus housing, they have to also make sure that they have missing person notification procedures and comply with our fire safety requirements. A couple other very important requirements of the Clery Act are the provisions that came to us under the Violence Against Women Act reauthorization of 2013. Under that law, we expanded reporting to include dating violence, domestic violence, and stalking. Schools are also now required to have substantially more information in their annual security reports and elsewhere in their publications and websites about sexual assault prevention and response. And we have to make sure that we're providing adequate accommodations and protective measures for victim survivors of these kinds of incidents. Again, we want to try to stop them from occurring in the first place, and we want to make sure that people are treated well and taken care of in those cases where these incidents occur. We also talk about the fire safety requirements that are not actually part of the Clery Act, but are part of a companion law, very important for schools that have student housing. And then we have the Drug-Free Schools and Communities Act requirements that apply to all schools that receive federal funding, not just Title IV funding. Any federal education funding requires compliance with that law. And while we're not going to talk about it today, we have information available on our website that would educate you about the requirements of those rules. Now, we talk a little bit about the groups that we work with at the Clery Group. Very important to understand that this is really an all-of-agency approach, and to some extent an all-of-government approach. We work very closely with the Office for Civil Rights, especially in the area of sexual assault prevention and response. We work with the Office of the Inspector General, States Attorneys General, and Auditors General, who have gotten very interested in the area of campus safety and crime prevention on campus, and as well as state law enforcement associations. Very often they'll come to us for information. We go to them for information. It's been a very collaborative and productive partnership, but it's important for schools to understand that a lot of different agencies and organizations are involved today. We work with the state crime reporting offices. All of those statistics that you see about crimes, those are mostly developed by the FBI at the federal level and by state programs as well, and we work with all of them. We also have a variety of interagency working groups, mostly with the Justice Department and with the Office of Health and Human Services. And then we also work with other organizations that are very interested in the issue of campus safety and crime prevention, especially advocacy groups at the state and local level. Going to the next slide, we often talk about crime on campus, and very often it is possible for people to believe that college campuses won't have to deal with the issues that the general society has to confront. That's simply not the case. In the world of criminology, we talk about the realities of crime. And one of the realities of crime is that crime can happen everywhere. Crime also moves. There's nothing sacrosanct about the boundaries of the campus. And so we often use this quote by General Michael Hayden, who's the former director of the CIA and the NSA, the National Security Agency. General Hayden once observed that, frankly, he said, crime is not a problem that can be solved. Rather, it is a condition that must be managed. And that is something that we need to remember as we go about our lives on campus. You know, we want students to enjoy campus life and to enjoy their studies, but we also need them to be very aware of the risks that can pertain in that environment. And so here we see the categories of crime that exist under the Clery Act. So that first category are so-called criminal offenses. Criminal offenses are all the categories of crime that they make all the TV shows about: murder, arson, sexual assault, robbery, burglary, and the like, the most serious crimes against persons and property. Then we have our hate crime categories. There are 8 distinct areas of hate crimes that are covered by the law. They include things like race and religion, but also disability, sexual orientation, sexual identity. So all of these are very important categories for us to be aware of. We also have our VAWA offenses, as we mentioned a few minutes ago, dating violence, domestic violence, and stalking. And then certain statistics for arrest and disciplinary referrals in the area of liquor, drugs, and weapons. Now, the point that we'd like to point out to you is that second bullet on the right. Under the Clery Act, a crime is considered to have been reported anytime it's brought to the attention of a so-called campus security authority or local law enforcement. Now, what this means is that many schools have a multi-step procedure for reporting a crime. None of that really matters for the Clery Act. If a student were to come into the campus safety office or go to a coach or a residence hall worker and say, I was the victim of a crime, here's what happened to me, that crime is deemed reported for Clery Act purposes. And it's very important for schools to understand that that's the way that it works. Going to our next slide, we're going to talk for a minute about who these campus security authorities are.
Who are the campus security authorities? The obvious group are any members of a campus police department or public safety office. The only difference between the two groups is whether or not they are sworn law enforcement. There are also people involved in safety-related functions who are not part of the campus police or public safety. Here you might think of the parking lot attendant who controls the arm of who gets access to the parking garage. This is a safety-related function. During COVID, institutions had people standing literally at the schoolhouse gate, checking people's temperature and asking them questions to see whether or not they were going to be allowed on campus. That is an example of a safety-related function. If someone reported a crime to one of these people, it's deemed as reported. That means those people receiving that information have to know how to treat it. Then there is the big catch-all category. This is anyone with significant responsibilities for students and campus activities. When you start to break it down, that is a lot of people. Keep in mind, every school has to have at least one campus security authority. So if you have a cosmetology school with 25 students and 3 employees, one of those employees has to be a CSA. Here are some of the most common CSA categories that you will find. You have the campus leadership, residence hall, the athletic director, coaches, Title IX coordinator, and in some instances, you will have student leaders who have official roles within the institution.
Going to the next slide, we have to deal with a very important concept called Clery geography. Now, to understand how the Clery Act works on your campus, you have to understand where your campus starts and stops. Virtually all of the requirements of the Clery Act are based on geographical determinations about buildings and properties that the school owns or controls for educational purposes. So that's known as Campus 1. The whole idea of how we determine where a campus starts and stops changed a couple of decades ago. It used to be a much simpler definition, but it didn't include nearly enough property, and so it was augmented. Campus 2 are buildings and property that are owned by an institution but operated by somebody else. So here we might think about the fact that many schools today have an official bookstore, but the college itself doesn't own it. It's operated by a third party. Many schools have a food court that is full of food vendors of all of the type that you might see in any downtown where you live, right? Now, those companies do not work for the school, but they lease property from the school to provide that service to students and employees. That's the whole point. Those facilities are frequently used by students and employees, and they're part of the institution's educational program. If students are going to live on campus, come onto campus to go to class, if employees are going to work there, sooner or later, they're going to want something to eat. All of those places are part of a school's so-called Clery geography. Now, the next category of Clery geography is a non-campus building or property. It sounds like something we wouldn't count, but the reason that we call it a non-campus building or property is because it's typically separated by some distance, right? Schools own all kinds of property that's not on the campus itself. Here we might think about a sports stadium or a research facility that might be a few miles away. We also may have properties or buildings that are owned or controlled by recognized student organizations. Very often these are social organizations such as fraternities and sororities that may own or rent their own house, but it's not on the campus proper. Issues that occur there, incidents of crime and other kinds of emergencies, are deemed to have occurred on the school's so-called Clery geography. And then we count certain public property. What kind of public property? Well, mostly the streets and sidewalks around the campus, for the most part, right? And any areas where a school may patrol, either through their police department or their campus safety department, could also be Clery geography. So let's look at an example. Going to the next slide, we see our classic career school that might be located in a small mall, for example. Do we count the whole mall, ladies and gentlemen? We do not. We count the areas that the school owns or controls. And so we see the part with the purple roof. Here we have a cosmetology school called ABC. In the upper part of the picture, we see where the classroom space is, the admissions office, administrative offices. That area is obviously part of the school's campus. In the lower part of the map, we see the clinic. Anybody who's ever visited a cosmetology school knows that there is a clinic floor where people learn how to cut hair before they work on human beings and eventually do work on human beings. And that is part of the campus as well. Now, you might not be able to see that 2 doors in the lower half of the map is a place called ABC Beauty Supply. That is a business owned by the same owner as the school, but is not part of the institution. And so it doesn't count as part of Clery geography. Unless what? Unless the school decides to start a salon management program, and part of that is learning how to sell beauty supplies, and then it might become part of the school. You could see how the boundary could move based on how a school operates. Going to the next slide, we see our more traditional type of college campus. All of the buildings in purple are the buildings that the school owns and controls for educational purposes. The red ones are owned by the school but operated by somebody else, an alumni association. Again, perhaps that bookstore example where a big national retailer is now running the bookstore, the food court that's full of all of the coffee and snacks purveyors that we see on campus and in our communities, right? Outside of that, we see a yellow boundary. That is the public property boundary, as we talked about before, the sidewalks and streets that surround the campus. That's the easy way to understand it. In the lower left-hand corner, we see a little arrow pointing to our sports stadium. That's what that little box with the blue thing in it is. That's our sports stadium. It's a couple miles away. It is still part of our Clery geography, but not part of the campus per se. Going to the next slide, we have to talk about one of the most important and sometimes complex issues under the Clery Act, again, dealing with the idea of fostering a culture of clarity and transparency on campus and a student's right to know. The original name of this law was the Crime Awareness and Right to Know Act, going all the way back to the 90s.
There are 2 types of warnings. The first one is a timely warning. This is a Clery reportable crime that may pose a serious and ongoing threat to people on the campus geography. An example of this is a robbery that has been committed with a gun on campus and they still have not been caught. The school must get that warning out quickly. The second type of warning must be issued anytime the institution has a significant emergency or dangerous condition that may impact the campus in terms of health or safety of their students and employees. This could be weather events, bomb threats, or a health crisis. As you can see, there's a wide range of emergency and dangerous situations that can affect a campus that requires communication to be pushed out to their community. This is the headline the Chicago Tribune ran on April 17, 2007, about the tragic shooting at Virginia Tech. The incident occurred on April 16, 2007. Within 24 hours, everyone was asking, where are the warnings? The Clery Act became a huge topic of this tragic event. The department was actively involved and found the school in violation of the Clery Act for the way the situation was handled and the lack of adequate warnings.
And so we want to share with you a headline that appeared in the USA Today just a couple months ago that relates to the tragic shooting in Uvalde, Texas, because it's a good example of the kinds of criticism that accrue to institutions of any type when it looks like the emergency management plan did not succeed. And so we all saw the horrific tragedy that unfolded in Uvalde. And in the days after that tragedy, the chief of the school police, Pete Arredondo, was asked why the response was so slow. And it wouldn't have mattered how fast or slow the response was. Of course, there was going to be anger and concern, but it actually got worse when the chief said that he didn't know that he was in charge of the emergency response. So if you were to take a look at our emergency guide for higher education, you would see that one of the most important pieces of an emergency management plan in the higher education setting, or any other really, is to know who the incident commander is. This is going to be the person or persons who make key decisions about the safety plan. And so it's very important that we make sure that those safety plans are up to date. Now, institutions, again, face all of the same kinds of emergencies that exist in any other setting, right? Again, we always want to think that the campus is a safe, happy place where people are pursuing their educational dreams, and that's what it should be. But there are also risks that we have to be aware of, and we have to be ready to respond to them. One of the issues that has really affected campuses this year is a steady increase in the number of bomb threats received. Now, bomb threats on college campuses, unfortunately, are not uncommon, but there has been a significant increase in the last 12 months as we've returned to on-campus learning. And schools have typically been targeted because of the students that attend them, or their location, or their teaching philosophy, or whatever it may be. For example, our historically Black colleges and universities have probably suffered the worst of it in the last year, and we've been working with those schools to address those concerns. But all schools need to be ready to respond to a bomb threat. And so we have to train people on how to do that. Our campus safety and emergency management professionals have a lot of training and expertise in how to do this, but that wouldn't necessarily pertain to somebody who just works in an academic department, or perhaps is responsible for answering a main customer service line, or any of our other folks. And so we need to train and advise them of how to respond. The first and most important thing is simply to remain calm. It's hard to remain calm when somebody is leveling a threat against your institution, but it's very important that we listen to what is said. If possible, we should record what is said. And these days, many schools have the capacity to do that. If you can't record it, write it down, right? Memorialize key facts, turns of phrase, the phone number that's used, right? Try to keep the individual talking. This is very key. Very often people will give up facts about why they're doing this, about what they hope to accomplish, about the kind of weapon that may have actually been planted. Now, most bomb threats, of course, are made and there is no bomb to be found, but we need to make sure that we have enough information to conduct a diligent search. And part of all of that is, again, to keep them talking. You want to listen for voice patterns, accents, inflections, and intonations in a person's voice. Sometimes we can tell if it's a young person, if they're laughing, it might just be, kids who are engaging in some kind of unfortunate prank. Whereas a more sophisticated actor will very often make some kind of a political statement or talk about the actual specifics of the device itself. It's a good idea to listen for background noise or any other indication. Sometimes it's a bell on a church or another building that sometimes we can tell what time of day it was or the location that the threat is coming from. Also, we want to try to get as much information, again, from our caller or from somebody who is engaging in text messaging with the school. That has happened, bomb threat by text message. And so we need to try to get, again, information that we will be able to use and share with law enforcement. Law enforcement, once they get involved, are going to want to know the answers to these types of questions. Did the person say whether or not they are part of a group? Did they mention if they're acting alone? If they're part of a group, what's its name? What's the goals and objectives of the group? What kind of strategies do they have for success? Interestingly enough, again, research shows that the person who phones in a bomb threat is often very willing to give you a lot of information about who they are and why they're doing this. Again, that they want the attention, right? Try to get them to talk about what kind of device it is, what it looks like, what kind of detonator is on it, and what will make it go off and when. And then whether or not the device is volatile. These are all the sorts of information, again, that law enforcement is going to ask you to share with them. Now, as we go to the next slide, we talk about the other aspects of responding to these kinds of emergencies. We want to train our communication hub staff. Again, this is not just training that should be given to the folks in the campus safety office. We want others to have this information. We want to give them tools that they can use, checklists to make notes about these things. And we have some of those resources that we can share with you if you choose to contact us. You also want to make sure that you're coordinating with local law enforcement and emergency managers. This is not something necessarily that schools should try to handle alone. Very often you'll find that other schools, civic organizations, churches, and the like have received bomb threats right about the time you have. And this way we can have a coordinated response. We want to make sure that we've developed our emergency management plans and included bomb threats as one of the contingencies. Very often, again, this gets let out. We want to make sure that we maintain close hold on the key components of the plan. You don't necessarily want everyone to be able to look up exactly how you're going to respond to a bomb threat, because then people could manipulate or utilize that plan that you have to their advantage instead of yours. And we want to make sure that we're customizing the plan. There's a lot of information out there, not only on the department's various websites, but the Department of Homeland Security, the Justice Department, that gives people raw material to use to build a plan. But sometimes schools simply implement the entire draft structure from one of those resources, and it might not work for you. Got to customize. And then we want to make sure that we're planning for foreseeable contingencies. We don't want to allow our energy to go in every direction. We want to think about the most likely things that would happen under a particular type of emergency and plan for those. And then we want to use technology to the extent possible, again, increasingly to issue warnings and directives to our students and employees. We use text messages or other technology. And then we always want to have an after action report. What's the idea here? The idea is that we take a look at how our plan worked, the issues we had to respond to, where our response was successful, and where we might need to make improvement. And going to the next slide, we just think about the basics of an emergency management plan. Every school needs one. What it looks like is going to be unique to your institution. And the first step is to simply get organized, identify the various risks and threats that we're facing. Then we want to conduct a risk assessment. So now that we have an idea of our risks and hazards, what are we going to do about it, right? From there, we develop our emergency management plan, then we implement it and we test it where we can. Under the Clery Act, schools are actually required to conduct tests of emergency procedures annually. And we encourage you to memorialize that test. And then, of course, make adjustments to your plan as needed. We always want to point out our action guide for emergency management at institutions of higher education. This is a joint publication of the Department of Ed along with FEMA, the Justice Department, and others across the federal system that was produced to help schools create a plan that works for them.
Campus sexual assaults have become an increasingly huge problem at institutions. The Violence Against Women Act, also known as VAWA, first passed in 1994, and then it was reauthorized in the year 2000, 2005, 2013, and now in 2022. VAWA is aimed at addressing sexual assault and other forms of gender-based violence by expanding access to safety and support for survivors and increasing community-wide prevention efforts. All institutions that participate in Title IV have to have ongoing awareness and prevention programs around the issue of sexual violence. Institutions vary in size, so what the department looks for is an indication that schools are being proactive in these areas as required. Another key provision that the VAWA Act includes is that institutions also have to start offering many more accommodations, protective measures, and services to victim survivors of sexual violence. When it comes to disciplinary proceedings, the following are just a few examples that an institution must include. They must explain their conduct processes. They must provide a fair, prompt, and impartial process. They must list all possible sanctions, and they must describe available accommodations and protective measures. This slide shows a couple of important recent resolutions. In 2022, an institution violated the Clery Act when it changed the sexual misconduct policy while there was an open case. An institution can only have one policy at a time, and that policy is the one published in their annual security report. In 2021, an institution failed to simultaneously provide written notification to both parties involved in a disciplinary case. And in 2022, an institution excluded a party from fully participating in a case of alleged sexual violence. I would like to thank you for listening today to our presentation on the Clery Act. If you have any questions or need additional clarification, please feel free to email James Moore, myself, or call our help desk directly. We look forward to helping your institutions. Thank you.